You've been told the Viking Age began in 793 with a brutal raid. But what if that wasn't the beginning? What if that was just the boom? This episode reveals the spark that came before the hunger, the fear, the desperate choice that changed history forever. So let's take a look at what the events and mindset would have been like just before the Vikings set the world on fire. The wind bites harder when the grain runs low. His name doesn't matter. He could have been your great-great-grandfather or just another forgotten name carved into a weather-warped stone. But right now, he's watching his wife count barley like it's gold dust. The two boys haven't eaten in days. The baby won't stop crying. Snow creaks underfoot. A neighbor stands in the doorway, cloak stiff with frost, eyes sharp, sharper than yesterday, with a message. They say monks on the coast don't even lock their doors, and their gods don't fight back. It was a whisper, a rumor, maybe the truth. But the reality is, hunger does something to a man. It strips out hesitation. It rewrites the soul. And across the sea, silver, wheat, warmth. We don't need to conquer. Just borrow a boat. Come back with enough to make it through the rest of the winter. And if we've learned anything from history, we know history doesn't care about your intentions, just your impact. Because what if that first raid didn't just feed the village? What if it sparked a fire across the north? What if desperation didn't just create survivors, it created the most feared force in medieval history? The Viking Age didn't start in 793. That was just the explosion. The spark came earlier, and the spark was very human. This episode isn't about ships, the shield, or the sagas. It's about the quiet collapse before the storm. It's about the final winter before the first axe was raised. We're going to go back, not just to Lindisfarne in 793, but to the years before, when the fields froze too early, when trade slowed to a crawl, and when the gods seemed silent. When a young farmer who had never lifted a sword in anger looked at his starving children and whispered, "There has to be something better." You'll discover how politics, faith, war, and scarcity combined like dry tinder waiting for a single spark. And that spark wasn't a bloodlust. It was a question. What if there's something more beyond the sea? We'll explore how Charlemagne's holy wars pushed the Norse to the edge, how the collapse of old trade routes tightened the noose, and how a few desperate men boarded a boat not to conquer, but to survive. This episode will bust myths. They weren't just raiders. They were farmers, traders, fathers. They didn't start the Viking Age to burn the world down. They started it to save their own. But once the gates are open, there's no going back. So what really sparked the Viking Age? Let's explore. The earth was dead, not just asleep under the snow, but hollow, hard, and silent. The kind of silence that makes your empty stomach sound like a roar, and the weight of silence that settles in your chest like 1,000 pounds of grief. Thormund pressed his palm to the frozen soil. His fingers, raw from wind and work, barely felt the cold anymore. He dug anyway, out of habit more than hope. The spade struck something hard. At first he thought, is this another rock? But when he scraped the ice away, he saw it, a turnip, small, misshaped, half-frozen. He cradled it in both hands like a precious stone. It wasn't enough to feed a family, not even enough to fill a bowl. But it was something. A defiance against the dead earth. A gift buried deep, clinging to life the way he was. He brushed it clean against his tunic, eyes burning, not from the cold this time, but from the cruel mercy of finding too little, too late. Behind him, the wind clawed through the bare trees, dragging smoke from the chimneys into the pale sky. He glanced toward the longhouse. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant they were burning the last of the pine, which meant it was almost gone. Inside, Inga would be boiling snow just to make the broth look fuller. She'd already stopped eating 2 days ago, told him it made her feel lighter, told the boys she was full. Their youngest had started chewing on leather drawstrings of his boots. Thormund dropped the spade, sat back on his heels, the lone turnip resting on his lap like a cruel joke. He dug with his hands for a while longer, clawing at the frozen earth, searching for another, just one more. Nothing. Just frost-bitten soil and a brittle stalk of last season's barley poking through the ice like a mocking finger. He hadn't cried since his father died, but now, as he looked out over the field that had once fed his family and now offered barley enough to mock their hunger, his eyes stung. Not from the wind, not from the cold, but from the shame. That night, the men gathered, not at the thing, but at the barn among the goats. The goats were lean. The herd was thinned by the winter and desperation. Low voices, flickering torchlights, faces drawn from the frostbite, fear and something darker. Halvard, Thormund's brother, broke the silence. A man down the coast came back with bread, wine, a cross made of silver. A dry laugh cut through the gloom. What'd he do, wrestle a sea dragon for it? No, Halvard said, eyes hard. He didn't fight anyone. Just walked in, took it. A stone house near the shore. Monks, no guards. The silence that followed wasn't disbelief, it was calculation. Thormund finally spoke, voice low. You're talking about raiding the Christians. I'm talking about feeding our children. The goat shifted in the corner, hooves scraping the floor. No one moved. We don't have to hurt anyone, Halvard added. Not unless they make us. And if they do, Halvard read his brother's eyes, they'll see what hunger looks like when it picks up an axe. They worked in secret. By daylight, they still hunted, still trapped, still looked for food in the frozen woods, for any sign of life. But by moonlight, they outfitted Halvard's boat. And piece by piece, it came together to make a journey. They patched it with seal fat and superstition. 5 men, 1 sail. This wasn't war. It was survival. The sea didn't want them. That much was clear. The waves slapped at the hull like a drunkard's rage. The salt tore the skin from their hands. The cold clawed into their lungs and sat heavy on their chests like an old curse. But still they rowed. Thormund barely slept, and when he did, he dreamt of his children, thin and pale, curled up beneath the furs with eyes like cracked ice. In the dream, he reached out from the ship for his son, but the boat just kept drifting. Then, on the 5th morning, the gulls came. Land! Halvard's voice cracked like dry wood. Frisia! It didn't look like the stories. The Frisian coast didn't glitter. There were no gold-roofed halls, no banners flapping from castle towers, no cities carved into stone, just low, rolling hills, gentle rivers, and green. So much green it hurt to look at after weeks of gray sky and frostbitten fjords. Even in the dead of winter, the land felt merciful, like it had never known hunger. They passed farms with neat rows of thatch-roofed cottages. Smoke curled peacefully from chimneys. Fat sheep wandered open fields. No walls, no guards, no spears. Just silence, stillness. The kind that made you wonder if the gods had fallen asleep, or maybe they just didn't need to keep watching. They don't expect trouble, someone whispered. They've never met it. And that right there was the moment when the line between need and temptation began to blur. They don't even post a watch, one of the others muttered. Why would they? Said Halvard. They don't know what hunger looks like, and everyone has more than enough. They beached at dawn, pulling the boat into the reeds. Smoke curled from the stone building just up the path. A bell rang in the distance, gentle, and to some it probably sounded like peace, but to the Vikings it sounded a lot like ignorance. He looked down at his hands, calloused, split, still shaking. "We don't kill," he said aloud. "Only take what we need." The others nodded, but no one promised. The monastery sat open like a tended garden of buildings, paths, and peacefulness. No walls, no guards, just prayer, stone, and chickens wandering between graves. One monk glanced up from his task, blinked once, and ran. They didn't chase him. They didn't need to. They went inside and they found bread, loaves of it, cheese, salted fish, barrels of wine, sheaves of parchment, and scrolls. Thormund didn't touch the gold or the silver. He went straight for the bread, broke a piece, and bit off more than he could fit in his mouth. To wash it down, he spotted a goblet of wine and took a drink that filled his mouth and ran down his beard. He took and stuffed 2 more loaves into his tunic. He continued to search and grab every food item he could find. Each piece he pictured feeding to his family back home. They continued to raid and collect food. They didn't burn the place down. No one died. They didn't touch the relics. At least they thought no one did. But need and greed are a fine line, and the consequences of taking too much may have irreversible impact later in the story. To this small Viking crew, they weren't thieves, at least not in their minds. They were simply fathers, survivors, and doing what was necessary. The sun was rising now, and the hills behind them glowed green. Every man to himself imagined a winter with warmth, color, and soft soil. The men had accomplished the first phase of their mission, and now it was time to return to their starving families and hope it wasn't too late. The boat was pushed into the water, heavy with bread, grain, dried meats, and even a few hidden pieces of silver that will cause more trouble than it was worth, both at home and abroad. Not everyone knew of the deception and the opportunistic few that had the biggest impact on what came next. They didn't speak of the silver, they just rode. Thormund didn't look back. He was solely focused on sharing the wealth of food with his children. That's when it happened. Before they made it home, Halvard, who had been dreaming of wealth and a better life, said, "We should go back," his voice low. "Next season, with more men, and this time we take food and silver. You saw those monks. They were almost happy to share their food." Thormund turned to him, eyes narrowing. "You want to make this a thing? You want to launch out from the fjord and take from others like it's a job? Come on, we're farmers, not raiders. They have more than they need, no one to guard it. Think about your family. We're raiding for them, not just to survive, but we're making sure they don't suffer." Halvard said this, and then he added, "I can tell you this much. I refuse to endure another winter like this one." The conversation ended there, but most were in agreement, and anyone who wasn't couldn't argue against providing for family. The problem was, during the survival raid, they didn't just steal food. They tasted something else. Potential for wealth, warmth, and ease. And ease may have been the hardest feeling to shake. And in that moment, Thormund realized they hadn't just crossed an ocean, they had crossed a line. And now, there was no going back. You've been told the Viking Age began in 793, when longships landed on Lindisfarne's holy shore and monks were slaughtered beneath stained glass light. But that's not the beginning. That was the explosion. The fire that lit the fuse started much earlier, quietly, in the frost-bitten fjords of a world collapsing from the inside. It was overstuffed. Too many mouths, not enough land. Farms were carved into strips along fjords, squeezed between mountains and sea, where one bad harvest meant death, not drama. You might think the Norse were fierce because they loved war, but what made them fierce was necessity. What sharpened their axes was famine and frustration, not glory. That's why the first spark of the Viking Age wasn't ambition, it was hunger. For centuries, it was the bones of Rome that held Europe together. When the Western Empire fell, its roads broke, its ports faded, and its coin lost value. The Norse, who had quietly bartered with Roman outposts for grain, wine, and silver, were cut off. You might assume the North was always isolated, but archaeological finds show Roman coins, Syrian glass, and Byzantine goods in Viking graves, long before the first raid. They were connected, but the web snapped, and a world that once traded for survival now had to take what they needed. It was the moment the market turned and steel took its place. No one could have predicted the fall of Rome may very well have lit the fuse that led to the whole world feeling the fallout of the Viking Age. Meanwhile, Charlemagne was doing his part to set up the perfect storm just to the south of Scandinavia. His army swept through Saxony like a divine storm. Pagans were baptized in water or became fodder for the fire. Sacred trees, idols, altars chopped down, removed, and burned. Monasteries were built on the bones of old temples. To the Norse, this was Charlemagne's holy war machine, a Christian empire expanding northward, leaving ash and crosses in its wake. In 782, at the massacre of Verdun, Charlemagne executed 4,500 pagan Saxons in a single day for refusing to be baptized. And Saxons weren't strangers to the Norse. They were neighbors. They shared gods, words, bloodlines. If it could happen to them, it wouldn't be long before Christianity would arrive in the lands of Odin and Thor. That's why the Norse didn't just see Charlemagne as a king. They saw him as a warning. But even then, what can a group of people that are struggling to survive, what can they do? There's a reason Lindisfarne was remembered. It had writers. Monks recorded the horror. They chronicalized, immortalized it. The English wanted the world to know what had been done. But what about the raids where there were no survivors? No scribes, no quills dipped in trauma. There are hints scattered. References to early attacks on the Frisian coast, river settlements, and even Dorstad. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles tell us that in 789, 3 Norse ships landed at Portland. When a local tried to escort them to the king, they killed him. That was 4 years before Lindisfarne. Was that a test run? You might think Lindisfarne was the first, but history is written by the victor. The Norse weren't much of writers back then. And in the case of Lindisfarne, the history was written by survivors. And the Norse didn't always leave any. So we must ask, did the Viking Age begin when monks screamed, then wrote about it? Or were there raids where no one survived to tell and claim the start of the Viking Age? The great confluence where it all came together. Overcrowded farms, harsh conditions, collapsing trade, religious war, all moved the Norse to band together as brothers, cousins, neighbors, and clans, trade their family farms for floating fortresses. That's not to say they didn't continue as farmers, but raiding became part of their survival. They were once tied to the land of the North, but seafaring technology opened up opportunities to move beyond the fjords. They didn't see themselves as pirates. They saw themselves as providers. One ship, 5 men, a quick raid, feed the village, return before harvest. But then there's the silver. Silver doesn't rot like barley. And eventually war pays much better than crops. The moment the first hungry man stepped back on Norwegian soil with silver in his pouch and bread in his sack, the farmer became a raider. The family became a crew. And the North became a storm. So no, I don't think the Viking Age began in 793. It began in the silence, in the hunger, in the whisper of oars before the scream of steel. Lindisfarne was not the start. It was the moment the world finally took notice. The Viking Age wasn't just built on raids, it was built on options. You picture a Viking raider like a force of chaos, wild-eyed, blood-soaked axe, and a death wish whispered to the gods. But what if the truth is far more practical? What if many of them weren't running towards war, but away from a frozen future they didn't want to inherit? The Viking longship wasn't just a war machine, it was a passport, a gateway to a new world in a time when most European peasants lived and died within 5 miles of where they were born. The Norse had a secret weapon: mobility. If your farm failed in Norway, or your clan shunned you in Sweden, or your jarl taxed you into ruin in Denmark, you could build a boat, you could leave. You thought the Vikings raided because they loved violence, but many of them sailed because they were sick of being trapped in a system stacked against them. The longship wasn't about conquest. It was about the pursuit of something more. Why die on a frozen farm when you could retire in sunny Francia or beautiful Byzantium? Imagine being 23, frostbitten, hungry, and watching your wife stir snow into barley broth for your kids. Then someone tells you, across the sea, the fields are green, the winters are soft, and the monks keep cellars full of wine they'll never be able to drink. Wouldn't you go? Many did. And not to stay warriors. In fact, countless early raiders didn't return to Scandinavia at all. They settled, married local women, became mercenaries, landowners, even nobles. Entire towns in Normandy and Ireland were founded by Vikings who decided, why keep raiding when I already have what I need? But here's the twist. Once you see how easy you can take something, it gets harder to go back to earning it. And that could be the main thrust behind the Viking infatuation with monasteries. You're told Vikings hated Christianity, but early on they didn't attack the faith, they attacked the wealth. To the Norse, churches weren't sacred spaces, they were hoards. Imagine walking into a monastery and seeing gold chalices, silver crosses, tapestries, wine, while people in your own village couldn't afford a second cloak for winter. The monks didn't farm, didn't fight, didn't even trade, yet they lived in stone buildings with warm bread and fat sheep. To the Norse, this wasn't holiness, this was laziness and hoarding. Worse, the fact that Christians preached peace, but their kings sent armies north to burn sacred groves and demand baptisms by blade, that didn't always sit well with the Viking. Inconsistency between belief and action will always lead to a revolt. So was it resentment towards injustice or justification for retribution? Either way, the Vikings had no problem sacking and stealing from the churches and monasteries throughout Western Europe. Most people aren't aware of the Viking economic plan either. Viking Age wasn't just blood and fire. There was a little financial planning involved as well. Raid, take silver, ransom, demand more, reinvest, buy ships, hire men, trade slaves, grow influence. They didn't just plunder, they networked. The same men who burned a church one year might return the next to offer protection for a price. Sound familiar? Well, it should. They weren't just raiders, they were entrepreneurs. And like all good entrepreneurs, they knew when to pivot. You might even say the Norse were traders first, farmers second, raiders third. But when desperation came, it flipped the list. When the crops failed, trade dried up, and the fjord froze, they reached for the axe, not because they wanted to, but because it worked. And once it worked, it became a way of life. Because there's a fine line between need and greed. And once you cross it, you stop counting your kills and start counting your coins. The Viking Age wasn't fueled by savagery. It was fueled by opportunity. And the Norse seized it with boldness, with boats, and with blood. The snow was still falling when they returned. 5 men, 1 longship, and a silence that swept through the village before the wind even had the chance. They didn't come back shouting. There was no triumph, no horns, just urgency and the quiet desperation of men who needed to know, had they made it in time. They dragged the boat ashore without a word. The sea ice crackled beneath their boots, but they moved fast. Each man took what he could carry, sacks of grain, salt-dried fish, bundles wrapped in cloth, and hope. "Go to your homes," Thormund said. "Feed them, warm them. We meet at the boat again tonight. We divide the rest together." They nodded, not because they agreed, but because they were too tired to argue. Thormund ran home, his fingers numb around the sack of bread, but he didn't stop. His lungs burned with cold air as the village blurred past. He rounded the corner to his home and stopped. No smoke, not even a whisper from the roof hole. His heart dropped. He sprinted to the door, kicked it open. The darkness inside was thick, but he could make out shapes. Inga hunched in the corner, clutching to her children beneath the layers of tattered skins. No sound at all. "Inga," he breathed. She stirred, barely. Her eyes lifted to him like two dying embers. "You came back," she whispered. A flicker of something passed between them. Maybe relief, maybe disbelief, but she was alive. Behind her, one child moved, then the other. Thormund dropped to his knees. The sack of food hit the ground like a hammer. Tears rolled down his face without shame. He broke a piece of bread, small and soft, and he placed it gently in Inga's mouth. Another for the oldest, then the youngest. They didn't eat fast. They didn't have the strength. But slowly, as if life were returning in quiet pulses, color began to bloom in their cheeks. A pot was placed on the hearth. Water boiled, this time not just snow and bones, but herbs, grain, substance. The fire crackled back to life, and with it, so did the house. That evening, the men gathered at the boat. The wind had stilled. The fjord was quiet, but the eyes of the five were sharp with purpose. A torch was planted in the snow. Its flame wavered, casting shadows across the boat's curved hull like a serpent circling prey. They brought their remaining loot, bundles wrapped in rough cloth, wine, a few tools, a wooden cross wrapped in purple wool, and silver. Two men couldn't resist the opportunity to take a little silver for themselves. Halvard stood by the prow, arms crossed. "We did it," he said, almost to himself. "We actually did it." The conversations turned to the next opportunity and the goals of each man based on the memories of what they saw but they couldn't carry. Silver cups, gold crosses, a little gold man attached to a cross. They laughed because they all remember seeing it. He was hanging upside down on the wall. The group divided the remaining goods in silence, but the tension grew with every cut of cloth and portion of grain. When it was done, the pile looked smaller than any of them remembered. They weren't sure if it would be enough to last the winter, and yet it had changed everything, gave them hope for tomorrow and hope for a brighter future. "I'm going to build a bigger boat," said Halvard. "For what?" Thormund raised his eyebrow. "Well, why not? We know where they are. We know they won't fight. That was one church, one coast. There are dozens more." Thormund didn't speak. "We could be there again in weeks," said another. "We could even go further south or west." Halvard's eyes gleamed. "Ooh, to the Holy Island. They say it gleams like the sun, like a sword fresh from the forge. Gold, silver, wine, all from fat monks with soft hands." Thormund finally asked, "And what if they fight?" "Then we fight harder," Halvard replied. And then he added, "Why plow a frozen field when you can pick silver from a cozy church?" The others chuckled, but Thormund didn't. He stared down at his portion of bread, dried fruit, cheese, and wine. The same food that had brought his wife back from the edge. He knew it was the right thing to do, even if it was wrong. He also knew he'd be willing to do it again for his family, even if it meant the risk of sword or sea. His biggest concern wasn't taking the substance they needed for survival. It was the silver that had the potential to make monsters out of men. "We took too much," he whispered. "The food is one thing, but the silver. Next time, they'll be ready." No one answered. They didn't need to. Thormund knew that from here on out, it would be different. Because in their eyes, the hunger was back. But it wasn't for food. It was for more. And as they stood around the ship that night beneath the frozen stars, the cold didn't seem to matter anymore. Because something new had come ashore with them. Something that didn't melt with the spring. Ambition and temptation. The Vikings, they weren't chasing war, not at first. They were running from collapse, from failed crops, feuding lords and winters that wouldn't end. But when survival is on the line, theft feels a lot like desperation. But then it sharpens resolve, and mixes with greed and boldness, and now you have the making of something explosive. They didn't set out to become legends, but they couldn't stay where they were. They didn't stay where they were, and that's exactly what they became. Look, we don't sail in longships anymore, but the world still shakes and breaks beneath our feet. Jobs sometimes vanish. Economies tilt. Systems change. Ordinary people start looking for ways out. And like the Vikings, some don't wait to be rescued. They build boats. They chase new markets. They leave the old rules behind. You thought the Viking Age was about conquest, but it was about reinvention. A broken world gave them no choice, so they made a way when there seemed to be none. So then, when the world shifts beneath your feet, the question isn't, will it go back to normal? It's, what will you become? Their leap wasn't greed. That came later. It was transformation. They didn't raid because they loved violence. They raided because they saw what few dared to admit. The old way wasn't coming back. So they crossed the sea and they carved a new one. Desperation can be a forge. It burns away the luxury of waiting. What seems like collapse may actually be the moment your legacy begins. They didn't know they were starting the Viking Age. They thought they were buying some time. A few more weeks of warmth, a few more loaves of bread. Here's a lesson. Risk always reveals what you're really after. Some, they risked it all to feed their families. Some raided to feel powerful, some for wealth and glory. And somewhere along the way, Vikings found their identity. And there is a fine line between need and greed. And you usually don't know you've crossed it until the fire is already lit. The Vikings didn't wait for fate, they chased it across the sea. So the question isn't whether the storm of change is coming, it's whether you'll stand still or launch and discover a new way forward. But will that way be the way of need or greed? Until next time, be bold, be strong, and awaken the Viking in you.